everyone. Benjamin Lindsay here, managing editor at Backstage. I see the waiting room is filling in as we speak, so I'll just give it another moment. But you are, of course, here to join me and Hannah Gadsby. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Happy
Yeah.
to be here.
How is it over in Australia? It's coming up on 11 a.m., is that right?
It is. It's a strange old world, like anywhere.
Like anywhere, yeah.
Sort of, Victoria's in pretty sturdy lockdown at the moment. That's where I'm living. But so it's sort of a waiting game.
Yeah, doing what you can, as we all are. Well, at least it allows for the opportunity for us to connect. I mean, I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York, and but here we are. It's the magic of Zoom.
How's it feeling over there?
I mean, the same. Just taking it day to day. Phase 4 restrictions are lifting a little more light than they have been in the last few months, but still living the quarantine life and taking care of business, taking care of ourselves for sure. Light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. But we'll see. We'll see in the coming months, I guess. But anyway, before we get started here, just give you a quick rundown. Backstage and our audience joining today, in addition to being fans of yours, of course, we are the working actors, creators, writers of the world. So I know that I sent along some questions beforehand, but we're going to be picking your brain a bit just on how you get your start doing what you do. But before we get into all that, first of all, congratulations on Douglas. I was such a fan of Nanette, such a fan of this show as well. I saw it in Manhattan last year, actually.
Back when crowds were a thing.
Yes, when we were able to do such things. But it was great to pop up on the Netflix queue back in May as well. Just given the context of, or the content rather, of Nanette, it wasn't really clear that you were going to be coming back to do comedy. So I am curious, just what made you decide to come back with this special on Netflix, and how do you want to set it apart from what you had already done?
Well, when I filmed Nanette, it wasn't clear that it was going to be a success.
Sure.
So I had an inkling because it had grown, with every audience as I performed it live. So it was like, I knew that it tended to strike a chord, but the translation from live to a film version is always a dicey sort of process. You gain things but lose other things. The feeling of in a room, I don't think translates necessarily. So when I filmed it, the content suggests that no, I won't come back. But it was a very layered idea there. Part of me wanted it to be true because I was exhausted, and certainly if I came back, it had to be on my own terms. And the success of Nanette meant that I could come back on my own terms. And Douglas is a very different show. Like it's, I kind of took a wrecking ball to comedy with Nanette, and Douglas is what I built in the aftermath.
Built in the aftermath, but still finding interesting ways to kind of deconstruct what you're going to be doing comedically. That's what I love most about it, that your approach in the beginning to still push the boundaries and kind of show the audience what you're going to be doing in an interesting and fun way.
Well, I thought it'd be interesting to contradict Nanette. So that's the basic premise of Douglas, was to defy expectations or to play with expectations, because I knew there was a huge amount of expectation on what would I do next.
Right.
So instead of letting that weigh me down and worry me, I thought, well, that should be the theme of the show, and then I get to play with it.
Yes. Yeah.
And with Nanette, my deconstruction of what comedy was, I pretty much contradicted it with Douglas. So that I declared that comedy was just a surprise, a question with a surprise answer. But then with Douglas, I've done the opposite. I've said, here's all the answers ahead of time. So it became a shared joke. So, and Douglas is, by its very nature, is a lot more playful.
Yeah, I should say so. Well, in terms of Nanette, you're talking about kind of the way that you deconstructed comedy in that way. There was a lot of talk when it first came out of your exploration of the setup punchline structure of comedy. What has the response been like to that specifically for you? Are you seeing any feedback from fellow comedians about how they might explore their work differently, just based on an analysis to that end?
Well, from comedians that I've worked with for years here in Australia, the response that I'm aware of personally, like I'm sure online and in private, people have had their own. People tend to say different things to your actual face,
Oh, you don't say.
but because we're brave. Um, so the the response was really lovely in a sense. You know, there's a lot of guys that have been, you know, doing this for longer than I have, who were, you know, challenged by the piece but were open to that challenge and thought about the way that they did things, and we've had some really fun, interesting conversations out of that. As far as the American response, you know, I think there's a larger slice of negativity, but that often comes from when an outsider comes smashing in and says, nah. People get defensive. That's natural. That's normal.
Right. An outsider
But
comes in and wins all the Emmys and the Peabody, and
yeah, I'm annoying, and I'll
right.
take it. But you know, that's sometimes what happens. You know, in any situation, you know, something needs a shake up, and I don't think anyone needs to follow my lead um, for the effect of the shake up to still happen. Like, just even if they're digging down on what they did to reject what I, you know, put forward, that's still a shake up. And so, you know, I think it's healthy. Like, I don't need people to do the same thing I did. That's a recipe for blandness.
Right.
But the fact that, you know, I forced people to wrangle with it, whether they came away with a positive or negative reaction, is neither here nor there for the idea of, you know, it just changes the way people think about what they do on stage, and I think that's important.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And the fact of the matter is, people couldn't do exactly what you do because you make your work so profoundly personal. That's one of my favorite things about it, between both Nanette and this new show, Douglas. Has that always been your inclination to kind of mine the personal? And did that take any fear to get over, to kind of share yourself in that way?
I think when you're starting out in comedy at the time that I did, it had to be personal. I felt it had to be personal in a way because I had to explain myself, because, you know, it's not your average sort of person that was standing up on any given night. You know,
Sure.
I'd follow a whole sequence of straight white men, maybe a gayer in there, but generally it was that. So I'd stand up. So my point of difference became, you know, like I couldn't not address it. And my personal life does, you know, like the meant that my observations of the world were going to be different. So if I just stood up there and, you know, started talking about Pop-Tarts, we don't even have Pop-Tarts. It'd be weird. It's just like that, because people would just look at me and, you know, if I didn't address my sexuality or things like that, because people would tell, then I couldn't get the laughs. People weren't relaxed because they're like, I need her to name it. Like, so I very quickly worked out, you know, that if I didn't explain myself, name my differences and wrangle those for an audience, then I wasn't going to get laughs. And I found that stories were a better way to get laughs and people on side. You know, like it's a better connection. Stories are a better way of connecting.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, you know, comedy is different here than, you know, like the audience is not, it's sort of, you know, it's a cheap art form. That's what I love about it. It meant that someone with my background and my network, which is no network, could get a start in comedy. Like, I think, you know, I don't believe that someone like me could have gotten into theatre just by virtue of access and, you know, because where I'm from, there was no theatre.
Right.
Like, it wasn't, you need an industry, a real industry, and, you know, to be able to have that happen. So that meant the audience is not necessarily sophisticated. And I say that broadly, like they are, like I am that audience. But there's a different thing between being on stage in a club than there is in a festival. And very quickly I leant toward doing festivals, which is different again, because you put on an hour, like you write an hour. So that tends to have an arc, more shaping than you do when you're just sort of like fighting it out in a club.
Right. Well, obviously, you're speaking from years of experience. It's been about 14 years since you made your comedy debut at the Raw Comedy Competition in Australia. At what point in that journey did you realize that this could actually be a career, a sustaining career?
Well, it was about 4 years in,
Mhm.
but to clarify that, I didn't have anything going on. So I was used to being poor. Like I was, functionally homeless, we'll call it, when I started doing comedy.
I did read about that, yes.
So that, that means that, for the struggle that it takes to make your start in any art industry, I think, as an older woman, it meant that I could cope with that because it was like slightly better than what I was doing before.
Right.
Even though you look back and go, oh, I could not do that again.
Yeah, roughing it was not something you were unfamiliar with, though.
Yeah. That real instability of life was something I'd carried, for the best part of my adult life.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, when it comes to actually putting pen to paper and writing out, whether it be an hour-long special or 10 minutes on the mic, what advice do you have for writers out there to do their best and to have a product to speak for them?
Well, I think with writing, writing is always going to be performed in someone else's voice, unless in the sense, like if it's for the page, then it's going to be someone's voice inside their heads, unless you're performing it yourself, reading it for the audible. But so you've always got to think about the voice, who's going to be actually bringing the words to life. And that's something I think about a lot. I write essentially for my own voice. But so I always think, like, for me, it's incredibly important to always consider both the voice and the audience, because it's a conversation. It's always, anything is always communication is a conversation. And often, there can be a tendency to just, think that your voice just goes out there, and then it's, on a blank canvas. But it's all audiences are incredibly dynamic. So I'm often wrestling with that, like, who is my audience?
Right. Fair enough.
As well as, yeah.
Well, I did want to throw back to an interview that you recently did with NPR. You had said that, in speaking about your autism spectrum diagnosis, which is in part what Douglas is all about, you had said that you had always seemed to be able to process an image at a speed and a depth and a nuance that you can't with language, and that's what kind of inspired your studies in art history. I am curious, just in terms of finding that voice, have you always had the inclination to study people in a similar way and kind of pick up on human behavior? Has that informed your comedy in pretty explicit ways?
They're kind of two very different things, because people I've always found incredibly difficult to read. And so I've studied people intently, because in order to navigate the world, you have to understand people. And that's not my strong point.
There we go. Yeah.
As an innate thing, like, that's essentially part of what autism is a relationship difficulty, like, and so I've been collecting all the data, we'll put it coldly, my whole life, just by watching, very, very rarely participating as a younger person. I very rarely, when people talk about their youth and they, like, get nostalgic about things they used to do, I just get nostalgic about what I watched other people do. Like, I feel like an active participant in life, and that used to, worry me and upset me. And once I was diagnosed, I understood that's my happy place. That's where, being in the thick of things is not actually where I want to be. I just thought it was where I thought I was supposed to be. And I think as I've gotten older, because I've been watching people, I seem like I have an innate ability to read them, but I've just been studying them.
Fair enough.
It's creepy.
But that's something that, in your words, something that you've always done. But it wasn't until just the last handful of years that you've been able to identify that as your autism spectrum diagnosis. How did that diagnosis kind of enlighten you to different forms of your quote unquote craft?
Well, it just gave me a shift on perspective, because I think when I was watching people, it was always through the lens of how am I, like, what am I doing wrong? Where, what's wrong with me? And now I know, and I know that I can't fix it. Like, it's always going to be there. So
Mhm.
it's taken, I think it's a healthier thing, because I'm driven to watch people in order to understand them, not in order to fix myself or
Mm.
mirror their behavior or mask my own needs and whatnot. So uh, it's honestly meant that I have more of a conversation with my subject matter, as
Mm.
opposed to just trying to fix myself.
Right. Which must be a nice weight off your shoulders, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've always got to work on yourself. I think that's human.
Mm.
But now I know there's there's better parameters for me to understand what I need to work on, and what there are things that I'll never be good at. Um, I always sort of put it at the, like, I was laboring under the false impression that I could make it to the starting point of normal, and now that I know that I can't, then I just get on with things.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, as we wind into the final minutes here, as I mentioned, our audience today is the working actors and creators of the world. We had a few audience questions come in just as we're talking. From Destine Damianides, how do you overcome writer's block?
Um, well, there's various techniques. I think if I you know for when I'm doing comedy, writer's block doesn't exist, because as soon as you're on stage, you got to say shit and make people laugh. So that's a really effective and immediate and frightening way to take that. You have to fly.
Mhm.
But like, there's different forms of writer's block that you get. Sometimes it's just like, there's no point. I'm tired. My brain's tired. It's not actually working. So I have to, with autism, yeah, I have a limited amount of energy. It's a finite resource on any given day, and I can have a cumulative stress that means that my brain ceases to function normally, so, or as good as it can get. So if I haven't slept, then there's no getting out of writer's block. I have to actually just rest. And then there's creative blocks, but they're just puzzles. And being active helps me. So I'll often go out into the garden if I'm home, or use my hands in some description in a very consensual, totally above board way.
Yes.
And because I find there is a connection between my body being healthy and my mind being able
Yes.
to clock it.
Have you been doing a lot of that during quarantine? It must be nice to be home after a year on the road.
Do you know, I haven't had this amount of stability in my life since I left home as a teenager.
Mm.
Um, and for someone on the spectrum, having routine is incredibly important. So
Mm.
I've actually got the rest I think I've needed since I've been, since before I could vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in that sense, I feel kind of grateful that I've been in the economic position to be able to make the most of that.
Hmm.
I think if this pandemic had hit before I could do this, I would have a very, very different thing. I wouldn't have been able to afford to have the stability that I have. So
Right.
it's a double-edged sword. It's just luck and timing for me that I understand that, this could have turned out very differently for me.
Mm.
And so I'm terribly aware that, when I say it's been good for me, that it has been, it's a shit fight for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So, my hope is that after, we work out what the world can be, that we try and work out a fairer world, and one with better safety nets.
I should say so. I should say so. Well, during this time, we have a question from Kaylee Hayner. What is the feel-good movie or performance you turn to when you need a pick-me-up?
Um, Like, what do I watch?
Yeah, yeah. Do you have anything feel good on your queue?
Yeah, I always like to go to watch Community.
Hmm.
It's, it strikes my my love of the meta, but
Mhm.
also the character Abed. When I first watched Community, I would watch that and just go, what's wrong with him? Like, he seems perfectly sane to me. And then
Right.
after I was diagnosed, I'm like, oh
Oh, that's why. Yeah,
yeah.
there we go. There we go.
It's like,
Well, I for one loved you on Please Like Me. Will we see you acting again, or is it strictly stand up for now?
no, I know when you say act, pretty much like, was I acting in Please Like Me? Um,
That's for you to say.
I mean, the reason I was cast on that was because it was drawn, I worked with Josh as a comedian, and he understood, he'd seen my comedy, and he's like, let's create a character out of that. And my comedy is pretty much me, but I'm not adverse to acting. But I haven't been asked to do much, but like, I'm a very idiosyncratic particular person, so the role would have to be exactly that.
Right, right,
I think if you have this like generic person going on an adventure, they'll go, let's choose this one.
right. Well,
Not
we
gonna
don't
happen.
want generic. We don't want generic. Well, two final questions for you then we'll wrap this up. Thank you again so much for sharing
My
your morning
pleasure.
with us. Obviously, we've kind of been touching on just the state of the world right now. Artists in particular have been hit pretty hard. Is there anything you could leave us with today, just in terms of overcoming roadblocks and adversities of this moment?
Well, I think, personal circumstances aside, I think it's comforting. If you're in the arts, then you're a creative person, and that to be able to have access to your creativity means that you're adaptable, and means that you have what it takes to navigate a moment like this in history.
Hmm. Fair enough. Fair enough. And so, final question. I love to cap these interviews with the piece of advice that you would give your younger self. Um,
Time travel's tricky. I was thinking about this, and I'm like, no, it'll ruin where I'm at.
yeah.
I need the shit to go down.
Right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Well,
But generally, it's like, I wish I knew I had autism earlier. I
hmm,
think, not that it would necessarily, it just would have been easier inside of me.
yeah. Yeah. Well, as you say earlier in this conversation, it is a weight off your shoulders to know it now, but still always self-improving things to be working on. But you're no longer trying to fix yourself, which is the important thing. We think you're pretty good the way you are, to say the least.
Ah,
Um,
that's very kind. Thank you.
I'm such a fan of yours, fan of Douglas and Nanette. Congratulations on the 2 Emmy nominations for Douglas. We'll be rooting for you going into the Emmy Awards next month. But thanks for joining us, Hannah. This is great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, and good
All
luck,
right.
everyone.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.